All right, Steve, welcome.
Thank you, David. A pleasure to be with you, as always.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about your most recent article in The Developmentalist. And as I was reading it again and getting ready for our conversation, one thing that came to mind was, do you remember the incident in DC at the National Mall? It was 2018 or it was a few years ago, where there was the Native American protester,
Oh, sure. The
Nathan
Covington
Phillips.
kids. Yeah,
Nathan Phillips and the
yeah,
Covington kid, Nick
yeah.
Sandman. And, it went viral. It was a big national controversy. But I thought of it when I was rereading your piece because it seemed like a very concrete encapsulation of the clash between these two worldviews, how that incident was interpreted immediately. On the left, it was, an elderly Native American man who was being disrespected by this, young, white, clean-cut little Trumper from a Catholic,
Who had a Trump
school
hat on? He was
who
wearing the
had
mandate. Yeah.
exactly had the Trump hat on. And of course, from the right, it was, oh, this kid is being, unfairly demonized and so on. So it was just a predictable flashpoint in the very culture war issue that you were trying to address and make sense of
Well, it
in
was a
this
viral moment
in
that
this
for the
piece.
left-wing media, it was too good to fact check, right?
Yeah.
It played into their narrative so illustratively, so perfectly, that the fact that wasn't really what was going on, at least not entirely,
Hmm.
that's why it became a scandal and ended up in a gigantic payout to Nick Sandman and his family by the Washington Post.
Oh, is that right? I forgot about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
millions. Yeah, millions. Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Yes. As we were just discussing before we started recording, truth decay, as it's increasingly becoming called nowadays, has consequences. I think you're doing something really interesting in this article, which is something that we try to do in general at the Institute, which is take two different worldviews that people generally think are somehow incompatible and try and show what they have in common or the ways in which they're complementary. So can you give listeners a brief overview of what your argument is and what general point you're trying to make, and then we'll get into the details in due fashion.
Right, right. So the title of the paper is how we can honor both indigenous, traditional indigenous knowledge, traditional indigenous wisdom, and traditional European social wisdom, which is, really not on the radar screen of progressivism at this point, for I think for good reasons that we can explain. But this article is really the second. I wrote an article about a year ago called "The Politics of Pride and Shame," and this one is sort of an extension of that thinking. Part of it is I live in Boulder, Colorado. Not recently, possessed by the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, and the fact that Colorado is plays a prominent role in the 19th century Indian Wars and is in sort of a legendary battleground of the entire conquest of Native American peoples. I do feel a sense of shame in being a resident owning a house in Boulder, Colorado. But I contrast that with the pride I feel for being an American, especially as a first generation son of immigrants American. I love America, but I'm also aware that we've done some misdeeds. So it's a sort of juicy area of the culture war, and it's an interesting subset of the larger culture war over anti-racism and the larger movements going on for several years around racial equality.
Yeah.
This into that in its own unique angle. So this is something I wanted to write about, and I'm trying to write about relevant political topics, right? So I wrote an article in December about whether human nature evolves, and that was a little bit more inside ball with people who are interested in integral philosophy. But
Yeah.
this one was triggered by the fact that I had read about the Biden administration has taken steps really from the beginning through a series of executive orders, beginning at the start of the administration, to mandate the inclusion of indigenous knowledge into the decision-making processes and policy-making of all federal agencies, everything under the auspices of the White House and beyond, are mandated by executive order or presidential proclamation that they need to incorporate, consider, consult with, and generally be informed by traditional indigenous knowledge. And that's what they call it, traditional indigenous knowledge. There are other names for it, but this dovetails with a lot of articles I've been reading in Quillette magazine, especially about the movement of decolonization that's very strong in Australia. And because Quillette's based in Australia, they have a special attention to that. But you can see it in other quarters. We're reading the Richard Dawkins article about happening in New Zealand. So the decolonization movement as a particularly militant element of the larger universe of, if you'll pardon the expression, wokeism, within progressive postmodernism, right? There's like layers of the onion, right? The decolonization movement is an interesting phenomenon unto itself, and it has a certain amount of political power through its larger association with progressivism as, a significant constituent in the Biden administration. And so the efforts to include indigenous wisdom are a way of the mandate to include it is a triumph for the decolonizational progressives, but it's also a way for the Biden administration to give symbolic wins and sort of work with that movement at the level of symbolism in a way that's it exemplifies the current dance between the sort of center left, modernist, mainstream left, is represented by Lucinda Ardern of New Zealand and Joe Biden of America, that the clerisy, as they're sometimes called, the aristocracy, the elites of the left, very much know that progressivism is important. It's sort of their conscience. They recognize that it's important, but they also recognize that, of course, taken too far, it would wipe out everything. So they have to deal with that. They've got to bull tiger by the ears, or however you want to say it. So without talking about the entire cultural spectrum, the point of the article is to say, look, the progressive postmodern worldview is taking a very important, larger historical move of recognizing the need to go back down the spiral of development, back within the history of humanity, and recover and retrieve and include very important pieces of our story that have been lost or crushed or otherwise wiped out. And so indigenous wisdom, indigenous knowledge, indigenous custom, the fact that these folks are in some ways royalty, in our society, indigenous people, that this is a first step. What I'm trying to do is be an ambassador of the future and say, okay, well, that's going to lead to the next very important step, which progressive postmodernism is not capable of doing, but which this larger society is going to have to do, for the very same reason that we have to reach back and include the lost knowledge of indigenous people. We have to reach back and re-include the lost knowledge of traditional foundations of Western civilization, right? And that implicates, part of what's going on is that there's all these different times in history occurring at the same time, right? So there's the time in history when indigenous people were oppressed and held back. That's still going on to a certain degree. There was a time in history when modernity broke out of the medieval traditional religious civilization. That's still going on. There was a time in history when post-modernity realized that modernity was morally bankrupt and had no sense of transcendence and had to break out of that, right? That's still going on. And then there's late postmodernism, where it wants to just reject and completely vilify traditionalism and modernity, these stages of cultural development that we always talk about. Those are all occurring at the same time. So it's the same thing like with gay, with gay marriage and the drag queen story hour. Gay liberation is still going on. There's still plenty of people in our society who need to appreciate that we've now moved to a cultural norm wherein gay people are accepted and included as normal people. That work hasn't been done. But then at the same time, there's this later time in history that's also unfolding, whereby the folks within the progressive postmodern worldview, they want to pound a silver stake into the heart of traditionalism, and they're not satisfied with gay marriage. They want the complete destruction of all traditional social norms. And that could be dangerous, right? So we're looking at multiple layers of history, and we're looking at multiple things that need to go on at the same time. The federal government's official mandate to include traditional indigenous wisdom can be appreciated from an outside and above perspective, from an integral perspective. It can be recognized as it opens the door for us appreciating other kinds of traditional wisdom that have been lost, but which nevertheless they're like a brick in the wall. Their values, if those were to be eliminated, the rest of the structure of cultural evolution would collapse. So recognizing the necessary job of retrieval, reinforcement, we've done a lot of transcendence. Now we have to move to inclusion. The integration of the polarities that go with that, right? Like grievance and gratitude, right? So much of decolonization is all about grievance. There's no gratitude in sight, right? Or pride and shame. It's all about shame, whereas pride is just seen as jingoistic or xenophobic or traditional, which is something that they're trying to eliminate. So anyway, that's a mouthful, but that gives you some of the context of the idea stream that I'm trying to channel in this paper.
Yeah. So there's a larger question that I thought of when rereading the paper, and I think it has to do with how we think about knowledge, and this idea of indigenous social knowledge and traditional social knowledge. So I want to come back to that in a little bit. But you mentioned the Richard Dawkins piece that I had sent you that I had read last week, and that I immediately connected with your article. You mentioned Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. So I want to, and we'll put this in the show notes because I think it's really interesting to read Dawkins's perspective from an integral or developmentalist lens, because he's sort of one of those diamond hard distillations of a modernist approach, and a sort of elevation of the scientific way of knowing as the best and only true way of knowing. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to read a quote from his article, and then see what you think about that in the context of your argument here. So Dawkins is writing about a recent trip he took to New Zealand, and he says, Ardern's government implemented a ludicrous policy spawned by Chris Hipkins' Ministry of Education before he became prime minister. Science classes are to be taught that Maori ways of knowing have equal standing with quote unquote Western science. Not surprisingly, this adolescent virtue signaling horrified New Zealand's grown-up scientists and scholars, and so on and so on. He says, I was delighted to meet Professor Cooper for lunch with others of the seven. His resignation letter cited the society's failure to support science against its denigration as a quote unquote Western European invention. He was affronted too by a complaint that to insist Maori children learn to read is an act of colonization. Is there an implication here, condescending if not downright racist, that indigenous children need separate special treatment? The very phrase Western science buys into the relativist notion that evolution and Big Bang cosmology are just the origin myth of white Western men, a narrative whose hegemony over indigenous alternatives stems from nothing better than political power. This is pernicious nonsense. Science belongs to all humanity. You mentioned in the piece the difference between liberal and illiberal modes of indigenization. So what do you make of Dawkins's take here?
Sure. Well, I could say straight off, it's true but partial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, elevating, the indigenous myths to the status of science so that they're equal, and they're not recognized in their sort of different channels of knowledge, right? One's a sort of traditional level or mythic level, pre-traditional, really deep ways of knowing that deserve to be honored and taught. But of course, science is its own endeavor, and it comes from modernity. It was a great discovery of humanity. I mean, we could find some pre-modern versions of science in various forms of civilization, but science as an institution that's changed the world forever clearly emerges with the Enlightenment, And it's clearly, something that modernity can claim as one of its greatest gifts to humanity. Indeed, scientific medicine, like he says in the article, Dawkins says, science has certainly saved your life. And I think that's pretty much true for everybody. We'd all be dead of sepsis or, something if we didn't have antibiotics or, So science does deserve to be honored. And the decolonization philosophy that's behind the political power of the elevating of Maori wisdom within the indigenous society, that within the New Zealand society, that we need to separate the dignities from the disasters in that, that there's a liberal version which is beautiful and which can be commensurate with science, and the illiberal version which wants to not only make the tradition, the indigenous wisdom equal with science, but ultimately can't help but want to just crush science because there's a larger, what we might call collective value commitment. Another way of talking about it is a telos of this progressive postmodern worldview. So Dawkins can't really see that as from an integral perspective like we can, that the progressive postmodernism is a coherent worldview that has emerged and can be compared and contrasted with the modernist worldview and the traditional worldview and the pre-traditional worldview. So we're seeing it as a worldview helps us see how it's a structure of values whose joint commitments have a direction, right? They're pointing it, all the values are sort of magnetized to a true north, which is the antithesis of modernity and traditionalism, right? In other words, it gained its power by pushing off against everything that was bad and unsustainable about modernity. And, there was value to be found there, right? There's ways in which modernity is, destructive in many ways and bankrupt in other ways. So this 60-year attempt of progressive postmodernism as a worldview to move beyond the establishment structure and truce between traditionalism and modernity that prevailed throughout the 20th century, that telos inevitably has reached a kind of a tipping point in its own trajectory. So at first it was motivated by a world-centric notion of inclusion, like all these people, especially those who've been marginalized, need to be included, right? But that world-centric sense of transcendence didn't have enough draw. There were few people who could really develop to the point where they could grasp and embrace a world-centric morality. So the crisis of green is that in trying to find political will at a world-centric level and finding it, they can't get people to be concerned about climate change in the numbers that they need, right? So they've been struggling to find a current of transcendence they can tap into that's going to make some significant political will happen. And what they've had to do is go back down to an ethnocentric level, an us versus them level. So even though it's supported by and protected by the larger culture of progressive postmodernism, which is in turn a kind of a pet of the liberal clerisy of modernity, this ethnocentric move, which shows up in the reverse racism that Dawkins points to, that is very much part of the anti-racism movement. Ibram Kendi is explicit about it, right? We just, we need to just turn the tables, right? Like if you listen to Bob Marley, there's a lot of healthy wokeism in his lyrics, right? He's got one song, slave driver, the tables are turned, So intersectionality is an attempt to kind of, okay, we don't like your dominator hierarchy. We're going to invert it and we're going to keep a dominator hierarchy. It's just going to be reversed, right? And so a lot of that ethnocentric energy, avenging our ancestors, we're going to avenge our ancestors. That reaches down to a level of developmental, or, evolutionary psychology. It gets us going, right? It's much easier to organize and to get people riled up if you have a bad guy, us versus them. It's hard to find the bad guy in a world-centric level because you're trying to include everybody. So by regressing to a earlier form of ethnocentric othering with intersectionality providing the hierarchy of those others, they've found a lot, especially in academia, there's a lot of people who are developmentally, they're in this green milieu, but they're basically have some mix of pre-traditional and traditional, to put it in the spiral dynamics colors. They're sort of red-blue. but they're in this green milieu and they got PhDs. And so avenging their ancestors is exactly what, gets them all juiced up. And so you see that in the decolonization movement. It's intensely anti-modern, right? In other words, the idea that married children shouldn't be forced to read, as if modernity is just a scourge, right? It's just black and white thinking, right? It's ethnocentric thinking. And so you see that, and I think the liberal clerisy, because of their lack of understanding of this larger holarchic structure of cultural development, they take modernity for granted. They don't really see it as being under threat from postmodernity because they can't see postmodernity clearly. So a little bit of decolonization energy, they can encourage that, just like, any angry political group, they can be placated, and they think that it can be. But what they can't see is that modernity really is under threat, culturally, values-wise, and that progressive postmodernism, if it were allowed to go in its full destructive, its telos of antithesis, if that were to be taken all the way, it would indeed burn down modernity and traditionalism, right? So they're not really aware of the cultural threat that decolonization brings. However, from our perspective, we can see that just trying to invalidate it or crush it or dismiss it like Dawkins is doing, that's not going to work. If you're in a boxing match with a stage that is more evolved, you're going to lose. So the idea is we have to do a judo move around that crisis of green, that crisis of progressive postmodernism, as it gets pulled into ethnocentric, political stances where it can find all kinds of energy, but which is ultimately becomes even more destructive than it would have otherwise been in its normal, telos of antithesis. And so that's why it's very important to say, okay, this is a challenge. It's a good challenge. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And it makes us appreciate that, for example, Dawkins, his blind spot is that he's saying, okay, science is true and good and beautiful, and this other stuff is nonsense. But what he's not, he's the primary perpetrator in history of, scientism's fundamentalism, right? So in other words, there's no getting away from metaphysics. You can have indigenous metaphysics, you can have critical metaphysics. The idea that the universe is a complete accident, that's just as big a fairy tale as, the creation story of the Maoris. In some ways bigger, because they should know better. So
I found myself
Dawkins stands for, the universe is basically an accident, right? The philosophy of oops, as Wilbur put it. And I think more and more every year that goes by, that's shown to be a kind of fundamentalism, its own religion. And so Dawkins is, if he needs to be aware of the part of the reason that indigenous wisdom is being mandated by these governments and is gaining traction and threatening science from his perspective, is science kind of dropped the ball by taking its valid method of methodological naturalism, right? Approaching the world as though it's just physical, and inevitably elevating methodological naturalism into philosophical naturalism, namely materialism, wherein there's nothing enchanted, there's nothing spiritual, there's no real transcendence. These are the very pathologies that led to the emergence of progressive postmodernism in the first place.
I found myself thinking that one of the key reasons for the disconnect is that we, and by we I mean we moderns, to the extent that we are all moderns, we have an impoverished view of what knowledge is, and you alluded to this before. That scientific knowledge is the only knowledge that's real knowledge.
But physical stuff is the only real thing.
I listened to an interview with John Vervaeke recently, and he gave an example of asking his students, if you want to get information, where do you get information? And they say the internet. If you want to get knowledge, where do you get knowledge? And they kind of mumble and be like, science. If you want to find wisdom, where do you find wisdom? Silence. And it strikes me that part of what you're trying to point to in this piece is that there are different kinds of knowledge. Yes, there's scientific knowledge, but then there's also what we might call social knowledge. And both indigenous cultures and so-called traditional or European cultures are providing that kind of knowledge. And it is a kind of knowledge. But we as a culture seem to lack the grammar for talking about a kind of knowledge that is not scientific, and valuing that kind of knowledge. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah,
That
sure. That's
yeah.
definitely one slice of the very interesting picture that's going on right now. And from Vervaeke's perspective, modernity is in a meta crisis because of the meaning crisis, because there's no sources of reliable wisdom or no reliable signposts toward authentic transcendence, right? Transcendence as an umbrella term to talk about greater than self-interest. And I think he's wrong. I think he's arrested at the modernist development because of his own metaphysical handcuffs that he shares with Richard Dawkins. And that is that the universe must ultimately be physical. All explanations need to go back to physics, or at least to biology. So I reject that. I think the question of knowledge is perhaps we can get a better handle on it if we talk about it in terms of perspectives, right? So there are valid perspectives at different altitudes of the evolution of consciousness and culture. And when it comes to talking about these stages of development, inevitably people get offended because I think we're talking about a strict level hierarchy where the later appearing levels in the sequence of development are necessarily better or more valuable. And in some ways they surely are. But in other ways, the lower levels are actually more valuable. And this goes back to Holmes Ralston's environmental ethics, his way of differentiating between a hierarchy where things just are simply getting more valuable and what we would refer to as a holarchy, whereas something gets more valuable at the leading edge, the previous stages of development also get more valuable because they're supporting more of the holarchy. Right? So this idea is summarized as fundamental and significant, two directions of value, right? That some things are more significant and more valuable because of them. So scientific knowledge is more valuable than indigenous knowledge because it can do more, it can save lives, it can prevent infant mortality, it can tell us about the universe. So there's ways in which we have to admit it's more significant and more true and more valuable in that way. But at the same time, as we make that move to modernity, that makes these stages of development before, namely the pre-traditional and the traditional, as we'll call them for purposes of this conversation, where there are perspectives that can see things that we could become blind to at these higher levels of. So science is blind to the enchanted nature of the universe, and that was seen at one level through a kind of an animistic vision that's characteristic of almost all indigenous perspectives. And then also a traditional mythic perspective that can also see things that the indigenous can't. So animism is a perspective that gains knowledge. Traditional religion is a perspective that gains knowledge. Modernist science is a perspective that gains knowledge. And we could also say progressive and integral are also distinct perspectives in this holarchy, each with its own take on knowledge, and our way to reclaim an answer to the question of where do you get your wisdom from is to begin, see now the wisdom can come from this new perspective that can take the knowledge of all. And so that's what I was trying to do in that paper, is show that, indigenous is one valuable perspective we need to recover. And so is the next above it, which is traditional.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in terms of perspectives, it also has something to do with the notion that we can have knowledge of what's good. We have a lot of skepticism around that in modernity. We think we can only have knowledge of, what is true, what is actually the case about the physical world. And we think that, well, truth about ethics and so on, it's all just subjective and so on. And that's the value add that both indigenous and traditional cultures, which is to say, most human beings, cultures who have ever lived, assumed. In some cases, not always to the good, but just the first principle, so to speak, that there are some ways of living and organizing our societies that are better than others and that are more perfective of human potential. That prior gets lost in modernism, and that's one thing I see you pointing to is that both traditionalist cultures and indigenous cultures recognize that basic first principle that we would just kind of call common sense, that the human mind can apprehend the good and incarnate that in institutions and in norms and in customs. And I think that, as you indicated before, this is where the new atheist types like Dawkins go astray. Uh, I was thinking about this in terms of my own teaching experience. I've taught the Bible for a long time in the Great Books course at Boston College that I teach. And I think that it's a shame that it's not taught in public schools because there's a way to teach it in a purely secular key. I mean, Jefferson, there's the so-called Jefferson Bible where he cut out sort of the rational moral core of biblical teachings and presented them as sort of self-evidently true. But imagine how much more educated of a populace we would have if every young person had a thorough education in the Bible. Its historical influence, its political and moral and anthropological insights, and yes, its spiritual dimensions. There's a way to teach that is not about indoctrination. It's not about taking the Bible as the literal word of God. It's just taking it as a wisdom document, not necessarily the best, not necessarily the only one, but as packed full of information that is vital to living a meaningful life. And, we can see why many conservatives feel impelled to, pull their children out of public school because they rightly perceive that there's an impoverishment there that's moral, that's spiritual. And so, yeah, it's something that I thought of a lot while reading your article.
Thanks. Well, and there, a huge part of the value of including indigenous knowledge, the idea that it's, good for environmental science, is kind of a fig leaf. I mean, it is good. I mean, I'm, definitely let the indigenous knowledge of their local, thousands of years on a land, let that be recognized by environmental science, as I say in the paper. But the underlying reasons are much more cultural. It has to do with reparations, at least cultural reparations for indigenous people, which even those who oppose decolonization and, the radical green anti-modernism, I think that they would do well to recognize that our own sense of patriotism, our own necessary pride needs to be, the only way we're going to reclaim that is to confront the shame, right? But again, if you're a decolonizer, that shame is all there is, right? Any suggestions that there's anything other than that is seen as labeled as racist right away. But I think there's a lot of arguments, they're very taboo in progressive circles, because the technique by which progressivism is honoring, bringing back, empowering, offering reparations for indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom, part of the way that's doing it is they're romanticizing the indigenous. And again, it's not all bad. There's many romantic and beautiful things about it. And the romanticization, kind of helps us to see that. It's the first step. But of course, there's a whole bunch of really ugly stuff too there in the pre-traditional. And maybe, that's not threatening. We've left that behind. We can take all the good and leave the bad. But when it starts to get ethnocentric, when you start to say you want to avenge your ancestors, then obviously it goes beyond romanticization. And we have to recognize, again, part of the way we can reclaim the modicum of pride necessary in our identity as a country is to appreciate the gratitude, right? The gratitude, I talk about this at the end of the paper, the idea that there's a net good for humanity. That's not, I mean, maybe that's talked about in some cases, but that's not on the, it's not talked about. So, I mean, if you think about things like infant mortality or life expectancy, or, the miracle of knowledge itself that comes about when writing is discovered, right? All of the disasters of living in the Stone Age, the fact that we've emerged beyond that, the fact that even though the Native Americans were brutally conquered, there's a certain amount of recognition that the coming of the United States, the coming of the rule of law, the coming of the great enrichment of modernity, the coming of all the good things that come from modernity, that this is this is something that is a net good for humanity. It's hard for Green to swallow. Hard for Green to swallow that Native Americans are not worse off, as a result of modernity, but there were warring tribes. The wars would, you could be raided and killed at any moment. Your identity was as a warrior. All of those societies were warrior societies, pre-traditional societies. And while there are beautiful and romantic things about those warrior societies, as for example, dances with wolves is a cliche, right? But that was the exhibit A for the romanticization of the warrior culture and its beauty. But the ending of war, the ending of a continent locked in war for 10,000 years, the conquest which ended all further conquest and brought peace to the continent, at some point we have to have some gratitude for that. At some point we have to have some gratitude for the tripling of the life expectancy of the people, right? If we look at in terms of the net good for humanity, part of it is look at unborn children. Would you rather have your kids born into the Stone Age or born into late modernity? Now we could certainly, there's some points to be made up for both sides, but I think only through a very blinkered romantic view would you prefer the Stone Age, right? And only some very lucky Stone Age tribes that weren't raided or didn't starve or didn't kill each other and all that other. So without going too into the grisly past of the pre-traditional, I think it's very important to recognize that there's knowledge there, and I'll make this one last point in this, in this little trope, and that is that the underlying power of indigenous knowledge is an environmental ethic of a web of life, the fact that we're all connected, the fact that there's a degree of codependent origination, as the Buddhists would call it. The fact that, Aldo Leopold, one of the heroes of the environmental movement, kind of came to this sort of environmental consciousness, partially independent of indigenous wisdom. But we come to find that all of this achievement of the green environmental movement is foreshadowed in indigenous awareness of the interconnectedness of the land. And that's it's a form of enchantment that I think that the Biden administration actually wise to mandate to be considered. Now, of course, it's going to lead to a bureaucratic tug of war that's going to make the administrative state even more inefficient. It might work in some places, like in Bears Ears. Bears Ears is the national monument in Utah that has, in its creation, was mandated as to be done in connection with the tribes there, the Mountain Utes and the Navajos and the Hopis and the Paiutes and all of the remnants of the indigenous peoples that lived in that area. They're now on the council, the board of directors for Bears Ears. And I think something could happen in a very similar way around the Black Hills of South Dakota. So there are some good models for how to bring indigenous people in, almost like, modern day, medicine men, who are there to advise the bureaucratic chiefs of modernity. I think there is a way to make it work, but only if the ethnocentric militancy of the decolonizers is kind of held at bay and isn't empowered to the point where it just wants to eat its own. So, whether or not it's workable bureaucratically, I don't know. I can say more, but that's enough.
Yeah, this point about romanticism, I think, is very important for getting at what's misguided in the illiberal forms of both progressivism and traditionalism, or reactionary conservatism, because I think, as you indicated before, it's arguably infantilizing, because it treats so-called indigenous peoples as if of the past, as if they were not flawed human beings like us. This is most famously represented in it wasn't Rousseau's phrase, but the phrase that got associated with him, of the so-called noble savage, who prior to the emergence of modern society lived in a sort of Edenic like harmony with nature, and its selfishness and domination and inequality and all these things were, you know, artificial corruptions from the outside. And I thought for a while that the romanticism on the left tends to be toward hunter-gatherers and indigenous cultures. The romanticism on the right tends to be toward the Middle Ages. And we see this today with post-liberalism, with Rod Dreher's Benedict option. I mentioned before, conservative Christians pulling their children out of public schools and sort of seceding from mainstream liberal society and trying to build their own communities. So it seems like both of these perspectives have a distorted picture of modernity, as you mentioned before, but also a distorted relationship to time, where they seem to posit the human good in the past. And so could we say that, paradoxically, there's almost an illiberal form of modernism that has a pathological relationship to the past. It thinks that it's completely benighted, and it is based in superstition, and so on. It seems to be getting in the territory of Dawkins's perspective, and I say illiberal in the sense that it undermines the very values that it claims to promote, precisely by trying to eradicate or destroy or fail to recognize the stages that it emerged from and that continue to make it possible. So does that sound like a...
Yeah, I would say that there are these larger forces, in the universe, right? A force of transcendence and a force of inclusion, right? Eros and agape is part of the way it's been talked about, right? And so when we think about it in terms of first principles as these larger forces, then we can see how both, if they're unintegrated, they both have a way of running amok, right? So inclusion run amok is a form of fundamentalism, and almost every stage of development exhibits its own fundamentalisms, especially at the end, right? That is, as it starts to mature and as the good that it's able to do becomes, less and less, it has to then create a more formal boundary, right? A cell membrane to preserve itself. And that's where the fundamentalists are the policemen of the membrane, right? And so Dawkins is a total fundamentalist, a scientism fundamentalist. And of course, his fundamentalism, ironically, is illiberal, even though he's a modernist fundamentalist, right? And yet we can see, traditional liberal decolonization is a hybrid of indigenous fundamentalism and, empowered by progressive postmodern fundamentalism. So all of these fundamentalisms are inclusion without transcendence. And we could also say transcendence without inclusion, is sort of what creates, modernity transcended, but it transcended so much of the previous stages that it lost all connection to transcendence. And progressive postmodernism has emerged to reclaim that transcendence. It's had a hard time doing that because it doesn't understand the principle of the degree of our transcendence is ultimately governed by the scope of our inclusion. That if we're trying to build a holarchy, we're going to keep collapsing back if we don't adequately include. That's the way evolution works at every level. Achievement is made, and then the next step builds on that achievement. It takes up and uses that achievement. And if that achievement is not preserved within the larger structure, it's unsustainable. So we can see these patterns of biological evolution and how they create the holarchy, which is the human body. And we can compare it loosely to cultural evolution. And this perspective gives us the wisdom we need to reconstruct a 21st century wisdom that will satisfy Vervaeke students, because the wisdom is there. It just needs to be integrated. We've got indigenous wisdom, traditional wisdom, modern scientific wisdom, postmodern wisdom. All that wisdom is there, but because they're all fighting with each other, they're canceling each other out. So this idea that we can have a kind of a transcendence made up of the best of all of these other currents of transcendence, that's a new idea, and I think a wise one.
Yeah, boom. A couple things. First of all, when you were describing radical transcendence without inclusion, the image that flashed through my mind, and I don't want to open up the can of worms of Elon Musk, though that would be an interesting conversation from an integralist perspective, was when he sent the car into space on one of his rockets. Like that
Yeah,
is the go to Mars, Mars colonies, uh, you know, Blue Origin, transhumanism, the space barons, like that's the other side of it. No
right, right.
inclusion. Let's just start over and get the hell off this
Well,
planet.
it's
But
a yeah, that's a great insight because so progressive postmodern, they want to burn it all down and go back to the wonders of being hunter gatherers, right?
yeah, and it's in
The,
Fight
the,
Club. In the end of Fight Club, when they literally blow up
the
all of the
buildings,
buildings which
right,
represent the credit card companies and the whole financial system. um
right.
like that's the and Tyler's visions of hunter gatherers on the highway, like
That's the way
hunting
they want it. They
deer.
want to transcend it
Yeah,
by just going like blowing it all up, burning it all down, and going back to where we were before the romanticized, lost, lifestyle. These modernist fundamentalists, especially these business tycoons. I mean, I don't know whether fundamentalism is the right term to describe Musk and Gates and the Bezos, but the fact that they're so drawn to transhumanism is another way of trying to just escape it all. It's like the fundamentalist. I mean, we're not going to just transcend without including. We're going to transcend humanity itself, right? I mean, talk about a radical transcendence. I mean, I think it's folly. And I think that their idea, I mean, studying artificial intelligence over these past few weeks, and before, but intensely recently, has really made me see that this idea of general intelligence, this idea that there's going to be self-aware, with its own purposes, artificial intelligence is going to, make humanity obsolete. I think that's a science fiction fantasy. I think that, the large learning models will create plenty of disruption, and they're a new kind of cognition. I'm not trying to, minimize the power and importance of the emergence of artificial intelligence. But the idea that we're going to have we're going to have singularity, and the computers are going to be the new dominant species, I think it's really quite
mm-hmm.
the levels of ridiculousness, the levels of hubris. I like to compare it to in the 50s. They found that they could create the chemical soup of the early Earth, and RNA molecules would spontaneously emerge. And they just said, well, we just have to create the chemical soup and we'll get life. But $100 billion and 70 years later, they've never been able to get past that gap between RNA and DNA, because it's an emergence that's not incremental. It's a giant gap. And the giant gap between self-aware humans and even animals is a similar kind of emergence, that they think they can just recreate mind by getting fancy, silicon arranged in the right configuration. I mean, it's a similar kind of fantasy. It's not
Yeah,
going to happen.
and there's a key idea here that I have suspected for a while, and I would really encourage listeners to think about, consider, perhaps provide responses to in the comments. And that is that there is a kind of unconscious animism that is all over the place in discourse around artificial intelligence. And before we started recording, we were talking about the work of Jaron Lanier, who's not throwing rocks from the outside at the Google bus, so to speak. He's one of the founding fathers of virtual reality technology, but he's become increasingly critical of Silicon Valley culture, largely because of how religious it is, in his view. And this is one of the main points he makes, is that there's so much projection of agency onto these algorithms and platforms and systems, that it's the alienated unconscious of modernist people who are not getting that aspect of their being exercised and activated in everyday life. And that's part of what I think the progressive perspective is responding to is we've lost this sense of connection, elemental connection to the world around us. And so we seek that in alienated form in technology, but in a way that technology could never quite satisfy. So you just
That's a
made me
really good
think.
insight about the
Yeah,
techno-animism and how
yeah,
it's kind of a leaking through of these
that's
older
right.
archetypes, that haven't been appropriately, given pride of place within the fundamental stages of our hierarchical development. And I think, I mentioned earlier about how there's these different times in history, different moments in history going on at the same time here in 2023. One of them is we're breaking out of magical thinking, right? We're no longer going to be controlled by magical thinking because it created untold suffering, right? But of course, trying to say that we could just eliminate all magical thinking, the only way you can do that is create, this atheistic form of magical thinking, the fairy tale that the universe is just a big accident and it just happened and that's it. That there is whatever we want to call it, magic in the universe. We can't understand it thoroughly. The indigenous understood it, but also, understood it in ways that we've grown out of, and that was clearly the kind of destructive magical thinking that's bad. Same with the mythic, same with the modern, but allowing for the fact that maybe magic is not the bad word, but enchantment is another word that's been used. That there's more to this than we understand or can understand, and that doesn't mean that we have to infantilize ourselves. The universe is intelligible, and as our consciousness evolves, we'll come to understand more and more of it. So right now, part of history is still going through the purging of magical thinking. Part of it is recovering it in an irresponsible way, as we see in progressivism and techno, utopianism. And then, hopefully this perspective that you and I are attempting to represent, right? This postmodern or, post-progressive integral perspective, that this can recognize the magic in the universe while at the same time also recognizing the need to eschew magical thinking. Right. In other words, what if you were going to have a gauge, full blown magical thinking, right? And, the kind of magical thinking that there's no magic in the universe, there's some integration to be made there. And that's another version of a polarity that needs to be integrated if either side's going to create value.
Yeah, yeah. And to begin to draw us to a close, another thing I wanted to respond to before the Elon Musk car in space uh, uh, tributary we went down is that you mentioned this, balancing transcendence and inclusion, balancing challenge and support. That is an art and not a science, we might say. And particularly in terms of balancing the input, the legitimacy of these different perspectives or stages of consciousness and culture. In a way, that's the new wisdom, you might say, that we're trying to fumble our way toward, to develop a new kind of social knowledge that recognizes the contributions of science in terms of objective truth, but can also recognize the legitimacy of these older and more fundamental and humanizing forms of social knowledge. You could call them cultural technologies if you want. And that's something we just cannot get out of. It's not something that admits 2 + 2 = 4 answers, as I like to tell my students. Like, we're stuck, and we need to just concede that the universe is odd, or rather, it's even and odd. The modernist scientific perspective wants to demand that everything be even, everything have the perfect logical answer, and be quantifiable and verifiable and measurable and so on. And that's just not the way things are. So we just got to admit that the universe is weird and get on with it.
Well, the universe is beautiful, true, and good, and our job is to not just recognize it, but to participate in its unfolding. And so, one of the direct ways we do that is try to evolve our consciousness. And when we reach this integrative perspective, recognize there's a practice there. It's an ongoing practice of working with the process of integration, which is never complete. A balance is a good word, but it suggests that there's a stat place of rest, right? Where it's just the scale is balanced. But in reality, both sides are creating value by steps. So it's never balanced. It's always, there's one, the inclusion makes the most value in a certain circumstance, but it goes too far. Then we need some transcendence. So it's iterative, recursive, dynamic balance that needs to be constantly readjusted. That's part of the practice. It's a difference between trying to insist on a still photograph, which would be the universe is simply even or simply odd, and a moving picture where we see it's moving back and forth, like a meandering river. Now that's all very abstract and, first principle oriented. But when it comes to gathering a political opinion about recognizing indigenous knowledge and including it in, the purview of our government, I think that that is a very interesting development because it challenges church and state, because it very much is a kind of a religious way of knowing. And yet it also points to the fact that we need to integrate that. But the way we could do it without having the Supreme Court necessarily having to strike it down or having it create a hobby horse, for the right, I think the best way to do it is to say, yeah, yes, indigenous knowledge in a liberal way, and yes, traditional European social knowledge, religious knowledge in a liberal way, as you mentioned with the Bible stories. This stuff's our heritage. We can't deny it or we'll become schizophrenic.
Yeah. So in the spirit of both support and challenge, and in terms of support, as I already indicated, I'm largely convinced by your basic point here that there's a connection between traditional European social knowledge and indigenous social knowledge. Both need to be preserved, retrieved, integrated, honored, and so on. My challenge is about not necessarily what you assert in your piece, but more about the way that indigenous cultures often have been discussed in the integral community, in spiral dynamics. We often refer to it as the purple stage of animism. And I've wondered for a while, is there a more nuanced way for us to think about that? You indicated before the idea that, sort of more fundamental doesn't mean less valuable, because it's more supportive of all the stages above it.
Well, less valuable in some ways and more valuable in others. More fundamental, less significant.
Yeah. And I've wondered if there's an analogy. So in so-called mythic cultures, right, there's literal understandings of the Bible. There's moral understandings of the Bible. There's allegorical understandings. There's mystical understandings. In other words, even within so-called traditional cultures, there's a spectrum of complexity that, probably, more people have a less complex understanding than, the mystical or allegorical stages or modes of interpretation. And I'm wondering if we could think about indigenous cultures in that way too. So it's not as if everybody was a literal concrete, animist who thought that there was literally spirits in things. That was a language they may have used, but may have often used in a more symbolic or allegorical way to describe their experience, which was on a day-to-day basis, just in more regular intercourse with the environment around them and the species around them that were part of their home. So I'm wondering what you think about that, about sort of non-literal interpretations of so-called, indigenous cultures. And I see this as another way of developing a more nuanced way of regarding them, as opposed to the infantilizing picture that, we get in something like Avatar and the noble savage trope. In other words, honoring the complexity and sort of range of levels of consciousness that, we're probably in those cultures.
Well, sure. We're talking about the overarching development of human history over the last, 5,000 years. So it's hard not to talk in terms of unpacked caricatures. But I certainly don't regard, those who champion indigenous wisdom, especially in our time, as being animists in any kind of way. And even the ancients, the pre-Columbian indigenous people of the United States, for example, many of them were pragmatic, right? Most of them were. I mean, they're a huge handle on indigenous knowledge in general, as it's being promoted by the United States government, is that it's a kind of know-how, that's not just theoretical science. It's like they know that the berries ripen in these places, and that the salmon swim for these reasons. That's very important know-how unto itself, and it's pragmatic, and it's not really animistic at all. It's just kind of, you live in a place for thousands of years, you know things that nobody else could know if they didn't. And so the hubris of modernity coming in and saying, well, we've got science, we can understand this place better than you can, that by itself, recognizing that there's huge know-how that may not perfectly fit with a scientific worldview, that's an integration. And I think many in the federal government, especially those who are sympathetic to green and the clerisy, they can welcome that, and they can take it in stride in a way that doesn't mean that they are completely empowering an indigenous religion, right? They know enough to keep a relative separation of church and state, but the intense separation of church and state that existed, for the last few decades, where anything traditional was just, ruled out and vilified, that it's too early in history, at least for the mainstream society, to recognize how to make peace, how to reestablish a truce with traditionalism, at that level, because they're still in combat with it. That the part of history where we break out of that is still very much going on. The part of history where we conquer, indigenous warring tribes, that history's long gone. That's no longer a threat. So to start by saying there is a very important understanding of the interconnected into nature, the enchantment of nature, the way that nature works that's beyond science, that we can begin to incorporate that in a liberal way, and at the same time provide a kind of recognition and respect and inclusion and even cultural reparations for indigenous peoples, because their problems are our problems, right? As a nation, the sense of patriotism and self-confidence that we need to carry on as a civilization depends upon us righting those wrongs. We've matured to the point where we need to say, whoops, we better make amends. But I think it's very important to end with the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. So we're talking about these steps of development in human history, but they're recapitulated, at least in a vague way, in the process of a human life. And progressive postmodernism is very much demonstrating the kind of the teenage years where the teenagers grow up, they're trying to differentiate from their parents. They see their parents as nothing but bad, stupid, idiots, embarrassing, cringeworthy, right? And so the whole trope of adolescence and late teen is to break off from your parents. But in healthy families, eventually, sometime in the mid-20s, they kind of grow out of that my parents are cringeworthy point, and they kind of begin to see, well, they actually are, I owe a lot to them, and they're beautiful people, and I want to honor them, and I want to go to Thanksgiving and have dinner with them, right, and love them. And that move of going beyond the adolescent rejection toward a reconciliation that doesn't give up, the pushing off against the negatives, but at the same time, recognizes that my parents are not so bad after all. And that's the thing when it comes to reconciling modernity and traditionalism. Both of those parents of our postmodern moment are their recognition and reconciliation is part of moving beyond our adolescence as a people.
Nice. Well, Steve, it's a pleasure diving into the piece. I loved it. Definitely recommend people to check it out. And I also want to just end on an Avatar note. I've been told that Avatar 3 will feature the fire Na'vi, which are the bad Na'vi. So I'm hoping that as the Avatar movies unfold, we will get a greater complexity. I mentioned in terms of the characterization of indigenous peoples, there was quite a pushback, as I understand it, to the recent films. as well as the original films. Um, and I'm hoping, and you can I'll plant the seed here so you can pass on to Jeff. I've loved his reflections on Avatar on the Daily Evolver, so hopefully we'll get some more from him in that regard at some point. But thanks again for taking the time, and
My
we'll
pleasure.
talk
Really
soon.
enjoyed talking to you. I look forward to doing more of these with you, and we'll put it up on YouTube, and hopefully some folks like it.
All right, great.